Hey everyone, before we begin this week's episode, I'd like to ask you all a shameless favor. If you could take a minute to rate the podcast 5 stars on iTunes and leave a review, it would really help us get the word out about the show and help others find it. We'd also like to invite you to join the conversation. If you have a topic that you would like us to cover, send us an email at jewishlivingpodcast@gmail.com. You can either write in or record your suggestion. Either way is fine. Who knows? You may be featured on an upcoming episode. Now, on with the show.
The Queen's Jewish Link presents the Jewish Living Podcast, the show that examines the many facets of Orthodox Jewish life. Here's your host, Izzo Zwirin.
If you're a regular listener of this show, you are in all likelihood an Orthodox Jew. And that makes sense. After all, this show is about living life as a frum Jew. You probably also have a lot of experiences in the challenges and gratifications of living a Torah life. However, this week on the Jewish Living Podcast, we acknowledge the truths that face many former members of our community. It should come as no surprise that there are many who choose to leave our community, but how many of us care to understand why? Well, today, we talk to one man who really tries to answer that question.
My name is Mark Trencher, and I run Nishma Research.
Mark shares the results of his eye-opening study and provides us all with things to think about moving towards the future. Okay, Mark, thank you so much for joining us this week. Can I have a little bit of a background about you?
Sure, absolutely. So I am a Brooklyn boy who currently lives in West Hartford, Connecticut, where I've been for over 40 years. I worked all my life in the business world, but I've been very involved in Jewish organizations. I was president of my shul, Young Israel, president of our day school, local day school. Currently, I'm the president of the Hartford Vada Kashrus. And many of my jobs while I worked in the business world were in research, market research, surveys, interviews, focus groups, all the things we do to kind of listen to what people are saying, to kind of hear our customers' voices. And it always occurred to me that in all those jobs I had in the Jewish organizations, we never really did any serious research. So anytime we had to make a decision at the shul, should we do this or that at the school, we were basically talking to ourselves. So I retired about 4.5 years ago, and I decided in my retirement that I needed to do more than just watch Netflix movies. I decided to start a research operation. It's really not a profit-making business. It's truly both a labor of love and a retirement project. But I do research for the Jewish communities. I've done a few surveys for shuls. I've done some surveys for Jewish organizations. And I've done 5 broad communal studies on issues that really had never been explored in the past. So I'm having fun. I'm getting a lot of feedback from people. I've spoken in about 30 shuls, and I'm just really enjoying doing research in our community, which I must tell you is the Orthodox world is just so fascinating to understand all the various issues and all the feelings people have.
So how long has Nishma been around?
Nishma's been around since July of 2015. So this July will be 5 years.
All right. And Nishma does a lot of research. So can you give me a little bit of a broader understanding of what type of research you're doing with the Orthodox Jewish community or the Jewish community at large?
Sure. So just as a way of introduction, I named myself Nishma because Nishma means, as in Na'aseh Nishma, Nishma means we listen. And really, I felt that there were issues in our community where we basically needed more understanding, and people just needed to listen. Back in 2015, when I was thinking about what I was going to do, so I had been reading, I like to read books, and I also like to read books that deal with the Jewish community. And at that time, I'd read a number of books written by people who grew up Orthodox and who left Orthodoxy. So, for example, there was a book titled Unorthodox by Deborah Feldman, a young woman from Williamsburg, and she told her story of why she left. There was an excellent book by a fellow named Shulam Dean, who was a Svera Chassid, and he wrote a book which actually ended up winning a National Jewish Book Award, a really well-written book. And there were other books. More recently, there was a book by Tova Mervis, the New York Times bestselling author, called The Book of Separation. The first one really written by someone who left modern Orthodoxy. And I decided to myself, these were all kind of memoirs. They're stories of one individual. And wouldn't it be interesting? So we have 6 or 12 or 18. There's a lot of these memoirs. But would it not be interesting to actually do some real serious research around the issue of why people leave Orthodoxy and all the things related to that? So I thought perhaps the first research I would do in creating Nishma Research would truly be Nishma, truly giving these people a chance to tell their stories and listen to them. The other studies I've done, just very quickly, that was in 2016. In 2017, I did a very, very broad study of the modern Orthodox community, beliefs, practices, issues, attitudes, covering a lot of different topics. I did a follow-up to that in 2019. The question is around Torah Umada. We interact with secular society. How's that working out? Is it benefiting us? Is it challenging us? How are we dealing with the challenges of being part of secular society? I also did in 2019 the first survey that really was ever done among Ba'alei Tshuva, people who grew up not Orthodox and at some point became Orthodox. There's a lot written about them, but it's all speculative, and there was never any serious research done. And then more recently, I did a study of the political views of Orthodox views, which also is one that had not been done. So I'm having fun doing these broad studies. As I mentioned, I've done research for organizations and for schools as well.
Okay, so you're doing all of these studies. Is it just you, or do you have staff or other volunteers that help you out?
Okay, so the actual work is just me. However, every study I do, I put together an advisory group. So, for example, the study of the modern Orthodox community, the one I did last year, the challenges of being part of secular society. I had a group of 16 people that advised me, and these are really prominent people from the modern Orthodox community. But also, I had people at Aguda, the yeshivish world. I had people with Hasidic background. I have rabbis, lay leaders. If you saw the list of people, it's a really excellent group. And their job is to work with me to come up with the questions we ask. So the questions we ask, and my view is, what do we need to know? I don't know what we need to know. It's an unknown. However, by reaching out to a dozen or more people in the community, we come up with a really good list of questions. The work of programming it, if it's an online survey, the work of programming it online, I do. I pay for a website that supports survey work. I pay for my own website. The statistical work I do, I have a background in statistics. I taught it at 3 colleges. The analysis, the report writing I do, a lot of it is interactive. So a lot of it I am dealing with my advisory group and asking them questions when they're suggesting things. So while I'm the only paid, really I'm an unpaid employee, but I'm the only employee, so to speak, of Nishma Research. Every study I do involves a really wonderful group of people from the community.
All right, so let's get to the study that we're here to talk about, and that's the one that seems to have started all for you, which is the survey of those who have left Orthodoxy. Let's start it with a basic question. Why do this survey at all? What are we trying to learn from it?
Okay, so there's a lot written on the topic of why people leave Orthodoxy. If you go to a place like the Aguda Convention, every 2 or 3 years, somebody will give a talk explaining, this is what's going on. We have youth at risk. Historically, it was called, at risk. Leaving Orthodoxy is one of the risks. There were other risks also in terms of things like drug abuse, for example. But, the people who are at risk of not staying in the Orthodox community, that extends to adults as well. And people get up and say, this is the reason. And you'll hear things like, the reason is lack of shalom bayis, lack of kids will leave because there's lack of marital togetherness and mutual respect among the parents. And therefore, the solution to the problem is, if you have this issue in your home, that's something you need to deal with, and that will mitigate or that will reduce the risk of the problem or even eliminate it. And there are other, I'll use the word simplistic, other simple explanations are given. And, I always felt that really the reasons, just in talking to a few people and just in reading these memoirs, the reasons have to be a lot more complicated. And I didn't know what they were. And I didn't know which one was number 1 on the list or number 2 on the list, etc. But I felt the only reason really to go from a simple understanding to something that's really more nuanced and more helpful to people to understand would be to do research like this. The other thing I would say is the research I do is not meant to be prescriptive, by which I mean I'm not My goal is not to tell you how to solve the problem. My goal is to tell you what's happening and for you to understand it and read it, and we can discuss it, and for you to develop an understanding of how to solve the problem. So, for example, in the study, I never use words like off the derech, which can be viewed as a pejorative negative term. It actually is not so much that anymore. In the report, I don't use words like problem. The problem is, the solution is, which is appropriate in some contexts. But for the purpose of doing a research study, I want people to read the research and to understand what's going on. So that was really the reason why I started with this research.
I want to get a little bit into the weeds a little bit because I happen to like research a lot. I don't do it like the way you're doing it with a like with a method. I just like reading a lot. But when you're talking about starting this out, so first of all, you have your sounding board, I guess we'll call it. Is there an IRB? Do you need an IRB for this type of research project?
So I have not. So an IRB would be a review board. It's very common in academic research, and I did look into it. So I don't go through that process. I do. Every study I do does have 100% anonymity and confidentiality. I'll give you an example. The survey of people who left Orthodoxy. So we have a lot of verbatim comments when we ask people things like, what would you tell, what would you want the Orthodox community you left to know about people who leave or about yourself? So people write hundreds and hundreds of words, and every comment gets read by myself. And if I use a comment in the report, I will never use a comment that in any way has the name of a community, or they might mention their shul or their rabbi, or anything that in any way can affect the level of anonymity. I won't use that. So it's completely anonymous. We do not capture the names of participants at all. And the other thing I would do is, as far as review boards. So, for example, on this study, we had various drafts, and one of the things we were looking for was to not have what we would call triggering questions. We're dealing with people who left their community, sometimes after many years, and sometimes under quite traumatic conditions. People who really, at this point in their life, some of them don't even want to talk about it. They want to be left alone. They're hard to reach. One of the things that a review board would look at is, if you're dealing with people who have these attitudes, you want to make sure you don't kind of trigger any adverse reaction. So we did. So we actually changed questions to eliminate that possibility by not asking triggering. So that's our approach. I would also say, among the people on my advisory groups, I do have several professional researchers and sociologists as well. And I've been in contact with a person who's a real expert in the field of data security and anonymity. So we do try to be very careful.
Okay, I just want to push on something that you said earlier, because I have the study open in front of me. You mentioned that you don't use phrases like off the derech and OTD. I'm seeing those phrases in this study. So, for instance, on the page that's entitled "Summary of Key Findings Continued," it says, "How do they now identify Jewishly?" The first thing that says, OTDers are post-denominational, by which we mean that they do not label themselves with typical Jewish world denominations. So it does seem like OTD is used.
Yeah. So the thing about the term OTD is a very interesting term. I spoke in one shul, and I said, what is your reaction to the term OTD? And people said they didn't like the, which suggests that the in OTD, it sounds like Bill Clinton, but the means that there is a single derech, and it's kind of a presumptive statement. One of the things I found out was that these people have, to a large extent, a lot of them have kind of adopted the term in a kind of a little bit of a subversive manner. So they refer to themselves that way,
right,
to make fun of themselves. The question I asked was, why did you leave the? I recognize that, but I don't ask people, why did you go off the derech? Why did you become a person? Why did you become off the derech? The question we asked is, why did you, what community did you grow up in? Are you still a member of that community? And some people said, somewhat. We probed that. Some said, I'm not. And then we said, well, why did you leave your Orthodox community of origin in terms of your beliefs and practices? So we really wanted them to, we didn't want to say, why did you go OTD, which could be for some people an inflammatory statement. So thank you for correcting me. The term OTD does appear when we talk about in that sentence, but we try to avoid that type of language.
Okay, so when you say that you don't use OTD, you mean we didn't ask the questions with OTD, but in the report it might be there.
And it might be there in their
responses,
as well,
correct?
in their responses as well. But in general, we refer to them. We say, why did people who left their community of origin is really the primary way that we define them.
In terms of the design, so let's just talk about how somebody qualifies for this study. Where do they have to start, and where do they have to be now?
Okay, so the first, even before we get to that point, how did we find 885 people willing to fill out almost a half an hour online questionnaire?
Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
Okay, there is like a lot of things in the Orthodox community. If I was going to test a soap, I could get online in 5 minutes. I could buy a mailing list of 10,000 consumers of home healthcare products and run a survey on soap. I could do that. There's no centralized list of the Orthodox community. Even before you get to people who've left, just doing a survey of people who are yeshivish, Hasidic. I could walk on the streets in Borough Park with a Yiddish language questionnaire. I mean, it's very difficult to reach people. So how do we reach people? Now, the people who've left Orthodoxy, a lot of them just want to be left alone. They went through a very traumatic experience with their community, with their family. They were denigrated, called names, viewed as flawed, sinful, mentally ill people. They move all over the world to get away. So how do we reach them? That was very challenging. The first person I spoke to in doing the survey was Shulam Dean, whom I mentioned his book, All Who Go Do Not Return. He's very active. He's active in an organization called Footsteps, which takes people who leave primarily the Hasidic world, and gives them primarily social support. How to speak English, how to look for a job, how to go to school, how to navigate the subway system in New York City. Things that you and I take for granted. These people who leave the Hasidic world are truly strangers in a strange land. They primarily offer social support, and they have a list of over 1,000 people in their few years of operation who've left Orthodoxy, and so they were willing to send a supportive email to those people saying, this research is being done. It's really to give us a voice to understand the journey that you've gone through and related issues. There's another organization, Project Makom, Jew in the City, that provides wonderful support to people who leave certain segments of the Orthodox world but want to retain. They want to move to a different place in Orthodoxy. For example, somebody who starts out Hasidic and wants to become modern Orthodox, they work with them. Neither of these organizations, this was not their survey, so just to make clear, they simply helped with getting out the questionnaire. Also, it was circulated through, there are several online communities of these people, so we got the word out through them. In the end, we got 885 people. Are these 885 people representative of the unknown number of people throughout the world who've left Orthodoxy? There's no way of knowing it. There's no way of knowing it. All I can say is we wanted 300 or 400. We got close to 900, and we're very appreciative of the people who took the time to tell us their stories.
When you went into the study, did you have something in mind, a number in mind that you wanted to get to, or you were just going to take what you can get?
We wanted to get at least 400 respondents. In the research world, the more responses you get, the more responses you get, the better the data is. What they call the plus or minus percentages. So if you ask a question and the answer is 70%, if the number of responses is bigger, then you're accurate within 2% plus or minus, as opposed to 10%. But even more important than that, so I decided early on that we were not going to just survey Hasidic people or yeshivish. I wanted to survey modern Orthodox, group 1. Group 2 would be yeshivish, what's called yeshivish, aguda, litvish. That would be group 2. Group 3 would be Hasidic, excluding Chabad Lubavitch, and Group
Okay.
4 would be Chabad Lubavitch. And we split them because they're different in certain ways that are important to recognize. I really wanted to get at least several hundred of each of those groups. So that's why we aimed for at least 600 to 800 responses.
Did you get any respondents that didn't really identify with any of those groups?
Yes, so we did. So we ended up getting over 200 of the Yeshivish, over 200 of the Hasidic, over 200 of the modern, and about 100 of the Chabad. And then we had 118 people that identified as other. And we asked them, what do you mean by other? And there were all kinds of answers. So one person said, I'm all of the above. He or she must be an interesting person. Like
He tried a lot. He or she might have tried a lot of different options.
Well, that's true. Some people move from one to the other. We had people that started as modern Orthodox, became yeshivish, and now are nothing. There's a lot of transition. That's something we found out in the later studies as well. But a lot of the people who said other, a lot of them said they're combinations. So people said, I'm Haimish, and they defined it as a combination. I'm modern Orthodox in some ways, and I'm yeshivish in other ways. And they gave some examples. But they all were Orthodox. All 885 were Orthodox, and they're people who no longer, who left their community. The way we said it, they left their community in terms of their beliefs and practices.
Right. So one thing that I want to clarify is when you say they were Orthodox, how are we defining, for the purposes of this study, as Orthodox? What's the threshold?
Well, we asked people, the first question we asked is, how do you currently identify in the Jewish community? And they had choices, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, they were all the choices. So they had to start out by telling us that this is about the question they grew up, the community they grew up in. They had to start out by telling us that they were Orthodox. And then we asked, which of these groups were you in? Were you Yeshivish? Were you modern Orthodox? Were you Hasidic, Chabad? So these are all people who were, we called it their community of origin. They all said, I grew up in an Orthodox community. And at some point, then we asked them, do you still consider yourself to be part of that community? So then they said they did not. And then we asked them when this happened, at what age, and how they identify now. But what some people view as the most important question in the survey is why did you leave your community of origin? But we identify them by their community of origin, the four groups: modern, yeshivish, Hasidic, excluding Chabad Lubavitch, and Chabad Lubavitch. So those are the four groups. And they're all people who no longer identify as Orthodox.
Okay, so it's all self-identification. Is if they identify as Orthodox and now they no longer identify as Orthodox. Okay.
Right. And you should, and as you probably know, in the research world, self-identification is acknowledged as the way to go. So
right.
As a quick example, we did a survey and we asked people a different survey, are you modern Orthodox? And one person came over to me in a shul and said, I know people say I am modern Orthodox, but I know, for example, that they're very lax about this or that. They're lax about davening with tefillin every day, or
right.
They're lax about tzitzis. So why do we consider them Orthodox? And I say, well, it's self-identification. If a person says I am Orthodox, then it's better for us to know that person is part of our community. So we know that our community is not 100% homogeneous. So we know that in our community there are X percent that don't daven with tefillin every day. So, but these are the people. If somebody says I am Orthodox, then for the purpose of research, that's what they are. And if somebody says I no longer am a member of my community of origin in my beliefs and practices, then they're telling us that they're no longer in that community.
So let's get into the actual questions that you asked. So you basically were able to identify the people that you needed for the study through the first part of the questionnaire that asks them where they were in life and where they are in life. What about the other questions that are going on? I'll let you take the handle. I'm not going to ask you about specific questions. I want you to let us know which questions you think were the most important within that survey.
Okay, just quickly, the questions that are important are why? Why did you leave your community? There are questions about the journey, about did they get support? Did they need support? Okay, there are questions about what have they held on to? So we're talking about Jewish beliefs. What do they still believe? Which of the normative beliefs do they still have? What do they still practice? Are there still things that they practiced when they were Orthodox frum that they still practice? How do they identify now? What is their relationship with their community? And we also asked them their relationship with their family at the time they left, and what's their relationship like now? Has it gotten better if it was not so good? So these are some of the important questions. We also, there's a lot of open-ended questions, 3 in particular. In addition to the one about why you left, what would you tell your community to help them better understand you and what you did and why you did it? 2, what, in retrospect, are there things you might have done differently? And the third question is, if somebody in the community was asking you for your advice, what would you tell somebody who's still in the community who's considering leaving? So these are some of the important questions. The report itself is close to 100 pages, but I will tell you that there is a summary section that's only 8 pages. It's a fast read. It has graphs. It's easy to read through. And I should also say that all the research I've done is all available online. I make everything downloadable, so you can download it and read it. It's nishmaresearch.com.
So I'm looking at some of the results of the questions that you asked. And before we get to the result, I just want to know, were people given the option of giving multiple answers? Because the reason I'm asking that is I'm looking at one of the basic answers, reasons for leaving the Orthodox community, and I'm seeing that it basically adds up to 100%. Were people allowed to give multiple answers?
The key question of why people left, we started out by having a question which said, think back to the time that you were considering leaving your community. Check off which of these you were experiencing at the time. And we had things like learning disabilities, domestic violence, sexual abuse. And we said, wait a minute, we cannot ask a question like that, because when you talk about triggering and memories and people thinking back to something that was a very horrible experience. So in the end, we decided, rather than giving people a checklist, the question we asked was a much broader question, and it was an open-ended question. And what we asked people very simply was, please think back to when you started moving away in belief or practice from the Orthodox community in which you were raised. What were the key things that caused your beliefs and practices to change? Okay, so this is an open-ended question, and we got hundreds and hundreds of long stories. We were basically asking people to tell us their stories. On the one hand, it meant a lot of work for us because there was no checklist. We couldn't just say, oh yeah, run it through the statistical program and 70% mentioned this. No, we had to read through hundreds of these questions read through them once and create categories, and then read through them a second time and tally up how many people. And some people said many things. I left because of this and this and this and this, and we were just checking these things off. It also means that we're talking about, in the research world, it's called top of mind awareness. So if I ask you about insurance companies, if I ask you, tell me which insurance companies you think of, and you say, I think of Prudential, Allstate, State Farm, Progressive, and Geico, and I write that down, and then I say, oh, by the way, have you heard of Lincoln National? Have you heard of Mass Mutual? Oh yeah. But you're mentioning to me the ones you think of. Similarly, when we ask people for their stories, they're thinking back sometimes 2 years, sometimes 5, sometimes 20, 30 years. They're thinking back to what their story is, and they're giving us what they remember. It's really top of mind awareness. Now, we're dealing with people's memories and recollections.
Right.
And we know that memories and recollections can change. For example, how many people said, I met a non-Jewish person that I fell in love with, and I decided to leave Orthodoxy because I really wanted to be with that person? Well, the answer is nobody said that. Nobody said that. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but if you're thinking that people, when they tell you their stories, are going to present themselves in a positive light, I do recognize that we're dealing with a qualitative response after many years, so that can happen. However, if you read the stories, they do really ring true. They really ring true. People were passionate. One of the interesting things I found was that people who had grown up Hasidic, I found their writing to be really very, it's hard to describe, but it was very, it had more emotion and more poignancy.
Interesting.
So I don't know why that is, more than the modern Orthodox, who are a little bit more analytical and factual. I just mentioned that as an aside. But if I look on page, there's a page in the study, What Caused Beliefs and Practices to Change. And, the top thing on this page 24, was, I learned things, I read things, they contradicted what I had learned growing up. And then I asked for proofs and nobody could give me a proof. And about 20% of people mentioned that. So that's the highest thing that was mentioned. And the percentages on this page go down to 3%. Remembering that this is top of mind awareness. And if you were to go back and give people a checklist and say, at any time when you were growing up, did you ever read something that you couldn't make sense of? The age of the world, evolution, etc. And it bugged you. And people might say yes. The percentage of people who might say yes might be more than 20%. But again, this is what people were remembering.
Okay, so let's get to some of the results of the surveys. Let's start with the most basic ones. For the question of why did you leave, what were the most common answers?
The most common answers, and I should tell you that they do vary a little bit among the four groups: Modern Orthodox, Yeshivish, Hasidic, and Lubavitch. But and they also vary between men and women.
Okay.
But looking at all the respondents, the one I mentioned came in at the top, which is a combination of I've been insulated, I was unaware of this or that, I saw it somewhere, maybe in the library, or I read a book, or something contradicted with what I've been taught in yeshiva or in seminary or in academy. People also said, I started to think for myself about things. It was, I really prefer a rational approach. So you do see a little bit of the personality of people, people with a more secular / intellectual bend, or people who like to kind of stray from the group thinking. Certainly, you hear that more often. So those are the things that came in at the top of the list. My questions not being answered, which I gave this talk at a school, and people really felt that there's a need in the community for teachers who can answer questions and are willing to answer questions. No question is dumb, and the answer is never because I said so or because the Torah says so. You're dealing with smart 12-year-old kids who deserve a thoughtful answer. So that came in at the top of the list. People said I just had general doubts over time. High up on the list overall, the role and status of women, this really showed up for one group, and that is modern Orthodox women.
Okay,
women who've grown up modern Orthodox, many of them said they just didn't like the role and status of women.
Sorry, let me just stop you there. That's a little interesting to me because I would imagine that in the modern Orthodox world, that's where women are, let's say, freer to do things than in the other communities that you're mentioning. That's me being blind to a lot of things, but just what from my understanding of the various communities that we're talking about, I would imagine that in the modern Orthodox community, there's more of a role for women than in the other communities that we mentioned.
That's true. A couple of things are happening. In the other communities, the expectations are lower. The Hasidic woman rarely interacts with a general counsel of an insurance company where she works, who's a woman, as I did. They really are they're not aware of a glass ceiling. The other point I'll make that's interesting is in the modern Orthodox, while close to 40% of the women mentioned the role and status of women as a factor, very few men mentioned it. Very few men, even husbands, didn't. So in other words, it's really a woman's issue and maybe a matter of expectation. So on the one hand, they're seeing a lot of growing opportunities, but these are people who want more.
I was going to ask you about differences in demographics, meaning what is a more common answer that you got from women over men? You already answered that one. But what about a more common answer you would get between the four groups? Something that sticks out to you by the Lubavitch group, or that's something that sticks out to you by the Yeshivish group?
Sure. In the modern Orthodox world, the role and status of women I mentioned. Another one that was mentioned more often in the modern Orthodox world was I left because of my sexual orientation. 11% of the people mentioned that. It was not mentioned hardly at all in the other groups. And in the Yeshivish world, interestingly enough, in the Yeshivish world, those things I mentioned, I thought for myself, things I learned. These are people who are very learned in the Limudei Kodesh in the Jewish studies, but they also are affected by things they hear outside their circle. People in the yeshivish world one of the things they mentioned more often than the other groups are religious practice, chumrot, stringencies, things being taken further than they wanted, the minutia of practice, and they also a lot of them mentioned that they feel that there really isn't that much spirituality, however they define it, in their Jewishness. In the Hasidic world, one that was mentioned a lot in the Hasidic world was that they didn't like the role of and worship of rabbis, and they felt there was a fair amount of corrupt behavior and hypocrisy. So things like the treatment of agunot, not being treated kindly, women who can't get a get, victims of sexual abuse being stifled and threatened, rather than treating the perpetrators. So the word hypocrisy was mentioned a lot. A few of the people in the Hasidic world mentioned they wanted more control in their life. They wanted to do more. They wanted to be creative, like in the Chaim Potok books, The Chosen and Asher Lev. That's kind of the old story. In the Chabad world, a surprising number mentioned weak secular education. So remember, the Chabad people are in the Hasidic community, but they also have interaction. They're not as insulated as other Hasidic groups. So they mentioned weak secular education. And also the Chabad more often mentioned that they wanted more control in their life. They wanted to do more. They wanted to be creative, which when you think about it, you can see that being part of something that a Chabadnik wants to do, because they already have some missions in their lives and some behaviors that are creative in terms of outreach. So those are some differences. The other thing I would say about all these reasons is, so we ended up having over 50 reasons, and people often ask me, so can you give me in 1 minute a summary of why people leave Orthodoxy, which of course is impossible. But what I did was I divided all these reasons into two groups, and one group I call the push factors. In other words, something inside the community that they didn't like, that they couldn't stand anymore, that pushed them out. So this is something that pushed the person out of the community.
And what would those examples be?
An example would be seeing somebody seeing a victim of sexual abuse being threatened while a perpetrator is protected. It's something
like the things that you mentioned already.
It's something in my community that says, I don't want this anymore, I'm out. So it's being pushed out. The other thing was pull factors, something that pulled me out, like the internet, for example. I see things on the internet, I'm being lured out by the outside world, I'm being pulled out by the outside world by something that I see. So my summary is, in the end, there were actually about twice as many things inside the community that pushed people out as there were things outside the community that lured people out. So I tell people this is good news, because we can't change the world. In our little 2% or whatever is 1% of the population, we can't change the world. The world's always going to be there. The world with its attractions and things that could lure people will always be there. But if people are telling us there's things in the community that I don't like, that I can't take, that are pushing me out, those are the things we can work on. So that's kind of a real quick elevator speech summary.
So I want to ask you about more of the fill-in questions that you mentioned before. What were some of the more poignant things that people said that they would tell the community now that they left, but how better to approach them now?
Okay, so we asked the question, many people don't well understand those who have left or may leave their Orthodox community of origin. What do you want to tell people about this group?
Okay,
So
that's a better way of stating it.
A couple of comments from the Hasidic community. I don't really care to tell them anything. So admittedly, there are people who have had it, but that's not helpful. Here's one. A Hasidic person wants the community to know, I am not a drug-addicted prostitute with AIDS. But what this tells us is that people are really, really, people who leave are being bad-mouthed. Whether there's truth or not, we don't judge. But the message here is, listen, I'm not that. I'm not that. Stop saying I'm that. One person said, it's a waste of time trying to explain they live on a different planet. So this reflects the fact that a lot of these people really have left. They've checked out. We're giving them a chance to speak to their former community. Okay, here's one. The tales of corruption and discrimination in the community are not myths. They are happening here in the US, and the person who leaves may have experienced some, if not all, forms of such discrimination, especially women. Believe their stories. Their feelings are legitimate. People who leave are not ignorant of some things by choice for the most part. So they need to be and usually want to be educated. Okay, explain if you don't understand something, don't shame. I'll give you one more from the Hasidic world. This one I really like. Please be kind and generous to people who are leaving. Understand that we are leaving our family, our friends, our social network, our belief system, and our understanding of the way life works. Please make us feel welcome, even if you don't understand us, especially in the Jewish communities that are different than ours. Our community is nothing like you make it out to be. Please listen to our stories, ask us questions, but don't pry. So those are, and you can see these are really, these comments sound like they're coming from the heart.
Yeah. So what about the other communities those are all Hasidic responses or former Hasidic responses?
They're more similar than they are different. From the yeshivish world, sometimes a person's emotional needs can't be met through an Orthodox life. Some of these comments you really have to think about what they're saying. Okay, we're not all disgruntled and angry at Orthodoxy or Judaism. So this one I like. It's okay to leave. There is not one reason that people leave. Don't judge me, for I sin differently than you. And then this person concludes, leaving is not an issue that needs a solution, but being Jewish is awesome.
I'm hearing a lot of don't judge me type of responses.
Well, this is the question. This is the question about what would you tell people? What do you want your community to know about you? So there's the don't judge me, and we have also from comments from modern Orthodox and Chabad as well. But you get the general. You get the general. I will give you just one comment from a modern Orthodox person.
Okay.
And you hear, we talked about the intellectual side and people who are grappling with intellectual issues. A modern Orthodox person says, the idea of a Jewish God is simplistic, ignorant of both science and history, and most of all, false. Being proud of your traditions and heritage are fine as long as they don't contribute to evil in the world. Oppression of women, LGBT, and belief in the other status of non-Jews is, in my mind, contributing to evil. So I will say that among the issues people mentioned, one of them was what's called exceptionalism, and that is that some people just don't like, okay, so we understand that when we are the chosen people, that doesn't mean we're better. It means we've been chosen to accept the Torah, to be an or, to be a light to the nations, or Lagayim. But there is exceptionalism. There is a view in some communities that we are better, and some people object to that. And people in particular mention things like homophobia and racism and sexism. So you do hear that comment fairly often.
I asked you before what the most common answers are. What was one of the surprising answers that you got for any of your questions in your survey?
So I'll say, first of all, I will say that I was surprised that the lure of the outside world is really not as important as we think it is. Okay, some of the surprises. So we ask about how was your relationship when you left? How was your relationship with your parents? Did they accept you? And how has it changed over time? So I was surprised to find that when we asked earlier about why you left, women more often mentioned emotional issues around being judged. I felt I was being judged. I was being categorized. Issues of modesty. Not surprisingly, women mentioned that more often than men. When we asked about, did your parents understand why you were doing what you were doing and were you accepted? Men more often said, yeah, my parents they're not happy, but there is some understanding. More than women. Women were less often understood by their families. And then we asked whether that's changed over time, and it has changed for both men and women, but it changed less for women. So women who leave Orthodoxy, even after 10 years, are less often accepted. But when we ask the questions about how important is it to you today that you're Jewish, women answered more positively than men. It's still more important for them. More of them keep kosher, more of them are Shomer Shabbat, more of them still do things like a Shabbos Tish, that kind of thing. More of them feel being a member of the Orthodox community. So there are some interesting differences between men and women. On the one hand, the women were treated more harshly, but perhaps it's their makeup, their strength, their emotional makeup, and the things that they feel are important to them. But they're doing well. They're doing okay.
Part of me thinks that the reason for that might be that from an early age, we're ingrained that whether or not you're Jewish is passed down through the mother. So I'm curious if women, even after they leave the frum communities, they still feel an obligation towards their communities to continue the Jewish bloodline. I don't know if you approached that in your survey, but I'm curious if that might be a theory as to why that is.
No, we didn't. There might be a theory. It might be a theory. A lot of these people, we asked them about their relationship with their children, and they tend to be very positive, and a very high percentage of the people who left Orthodoxy send their children to Jewish schools, and that may be part of an agreement where one spouse leaves the Orthodoxy and the other
Right.
one stays, and it's part of an agreement. But that is certainly an interesting hypothesis. So the women from the time that they left had a little bit of a different and somewhat more challenging departure, because their departure was more emotional, whereas the men's departure was more intellectually driven. Since then, they've had a little bit more of a challenging journey because their relationships were a little bit more negative with the people that are important to them. But they seem, in terms of where they are today, they seem to have come through fairly well.
So the study is really comprehensive, and I urge all of our listeners to go out and read the study, but there's only so much that we can cover in one podcast. The other thing that I want to talk about that I saw in the study was the kind of where are they now in their lives? Where are they living? So did any or how many people tried out other religions, other actual physical religions, not just spirituality, but went to a different religion entirely?
Well, we've heard about people who take on elements of the Buddhist religion. We didn't ask that specifically, but we did ask people how they identify now. So, Judaism in the United States is denominational. The first question in many surveys is, are you Orthodox, conservative, Reform, etc.? And so when we asked them where they started, we got the normal answers. I was modern Orthodox, I was yeshivish. When we ask them where they are now, these people who've left Orthodoxy have rejected their post-denominational, which means that the normal categories, Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Renewal, and others, are not something, they don't think of it that way. The biggest percentage said, I'm cultural, I'm a cultural Jew, I'm an ethnic Jew, or they said I'm just Jewish. 36% said that. Another 12% said I'm secular humanist Jewish. So the first group, cultural Jewish, they're certainly holding on to cultural elements and ethnic elements and just Jewish things. A secular humanist Jew is an atheist who still identifies as Jewish. So between those two, you have about 50%. Another 11% are traditional. So you can see these are the three big categories: cultural, ethnic, just Jewish, secular, humanist, traditional. You have to go way down the list before you get to people that still consider themselves part of a denomination. So they really, in terms of where they live, a fair number of them actually still live in their community. Remember, we asked them if they've left in terms of beliefs and practices. People told us, I look like a chassid, I dress like a chassid, my family thinks I'm a chassid. I am not a believer. However, for social reasons, I'm still in the community. So we have some information here on what we call half-lifers. They have one life in the community, so we have that. In terms of where people live, they've kind of moved all over. They live in different communities, so they're no longer bound to the physical community where they grew up.
This survey was done in 2016. We're now in 2020. It's 4 years later. Have you thought about doing a reprise or a follow-up study on any of these?
Well, okay. One of the questions that we asked at the very end was, do you want to get a copy of the report? Yes, no. Would you be interested in participating in future research on this topic? And if so, give us your email. We've never done it. So we do have emails of about 500 of these people.
Oh, wow.
Now, the question is, are those 500? So I could go into the data. The first question I would ask myself is, are those 500 similar or different to all 885? If I can convince myself that they're more similar than different, that they're kind of a representative subsample, I suppose I could go out and do a few follow-ups. I really am sensitive I'm appreciative of these people for taking the time to do the research. I'm a little bit sensitive to the fact that they really don't want to be bothered. They want to live their lives.
Right.
So we do have the possibility to do a study. The one that we did do, which is the opposite of this, the one we did in late 2019 was of people who grew up not Orthodox, but now identify as Orthodox, Balei Tshuva. So we looked at the flip side. And the one thing I will say that's interesting is we asked them in that survey, why did you become Orthodox? And some of the reasons they gave for why they became, the top reasons being intellectual, they liked the intellectual approach, and they felt it was authentic, are interestingly enough among the top reasons people within the community gave for leaving. That there was an intellectual reason that conflicted, and I left. On the one hand, on the other hand, somebody who grew up conservative said, "Wow, Orthodoxy, this is intellectually engaging and interesting and authentic," and I'm in. So that's kind of interesting finding.
So my final real question about this survey is really probably something that might have urged you to do this survey to begin with, but what can we learn from this? So now we have all of this data that came out. We find out why people left. We find out the issues that they might have had from their various communities and all things along the way and where they are now and relationships with their families. I know that you said in the beginning of this that you're not here to prescribe solutions, but what can we as the Orthodox community who are still involved, who haven't left, and who don't want this to continue, what can we learn from this?
Okay, so there's a lot that can be learned. So this goes back to Nishma listening. So the idea of doing this research is, first of all, the simple reasons that people give are not helpful. Okay, a simple reason like there's a lack of shalom bias, husband and wife get together, stop fighting, and that'll solve the problem. It might help, but it may not solve the problem. It may not do anything. It's important that we really listen to these people in their own voices and not demonize them. So what I've been trying to do, I've spoken in 30 shuls or schools, and about half of them, one of my talks was on this topic. I'm trying to really get the word out and to encourage people to listen. I did approach one major player in the Jewish podcast world that was interested. I was going to put together a series of 5 one-hour podcasts, really aimed at parents and teachers, to really just explain to them so that they understand. In the end, it didn't happen. I think this is a topic that makes people nervous and unhappy, and so I thank you so much for sharing this information. I think it's important. I would encourage a parent of a teenager, even if you see no signs of a child having doubts or thinking they might leave. I think this is just good information to have to understand what kids and adults are thinking, the various thoughts that are going through their mind. It's a challenging world. It's even more challenging in 2020 than it was in 2016. And we live in secular society. So, the key thing is take the time, start with the summary. It's only 7 pages.
Right.
Listen to podcasts, and just understand what's going on. I think that's really the important thing people can do.
All right. If people want to find out more about your organization, about Nishma, where can they find you?
So if you go to Nishma, Nishma, research.com, you can download all the reports. You'll find that it's pretty easy to find everything. One of the tabs at the top is contact. And if you go there, you can actually send me an email. I respond to all emails. So you can ask me a question or whatever. So I respond to all emails.
Do you take requests for surveys to run?
Sure. I take requests for surveys to run. If somebody has, I've done the surveys I do. I should tell you that some of the research I do pro bono, which means I don't charge anything. I do have some expenses. Those that I charge for are so inexpensive that what I make hourly after all the work done is way below minimum wage. So I do love if somebody says, the survey of Balei Tshuva came to me because I was talking in a shul and people came over to me and said, you really are underestimating the size of our group, and people have no idea what we're going through. So they encouraged me to do a survey, which I did. So we take requests for surveys. The other thing would be if you're a member of an organization, if you think a talk before a live organization about any of these issues, what it's like growing up as a teenager, educational challenges, any of the things I talk about in my studies, I'd love to visit communities. My goal is just to share what we learn.
Wow, that's very noble. Are you on any social media platforms?
I'm on Facebook. You can look me up, Mark Trencher. I'm on Instagram, but I don't use it. I'm on Twitter, but I don't really use it. What other platforms are there? I think I'm on many platforms, but really the easiest way is through my website. Go to the contact me page, or on Facebook. Yeah, I started this study by reaching out to Shulam Dean, who's a very well-known author. He was not a friend of mine, but I reached out to him through Facebook Messenger.
Yeah.
And I said, let's get together. We met at a cafe on Kings Highway in Brooklyn, and that's how it all started. So definitely, people can reach out to me. I love talking research, and I love to have conversations with people.
Very good. Mark Trencher, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Izzo. I appreciate it very much.
My thanks to Mark Trencher for joining me this week. If you have the chance, please read through the studies conducted by Nishma Research, and not just the one we discussed today. They do have a lot of very eye-opening studies. Like Mark said, we in the frum world have a lot of soul-searching we can do, especially in light of these findings. There are those within our community that are not happy here, and instead of doing more to drive them away, we can certainly try to bring them closer. We do that first by listening. Normally on the show, our audience is almost exclusively Orthodox Jews, as I mentioned at the opening. But based on the conversation this week, I'm willing to bet that this episode reaches some who have left our community. And I address this following question to you. What are some of the things this study may have missed? Anything you think needs to further dive into? Or do you have any thoughts as to how we cover the story? We're always eager to hear your thoughts. And for everybody, as always, Kol Tov.
The Jewish Living Podcast is produced by Sroli Pikus. Our theme song is The Band by A.B. Rottenberg from Journeys 4. You can email the show at jewishlivingpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter at Jewish_living. The Jewish Living Podcast is recorded in conjunction with the Queen's Jewish Link.